What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm back with my final video on Imperial Format. And I'm closing out this format just like I have closed out formats in the past with a tier list. So in this video, I'm just going to be going through and ranking the decks that I've shown off from this format on this tier list here. Now, of course, this is only my opinion, so you can definitely disagree. I'll leave a link to the tier maker in the description down below if you want to make a tier list for this for yourself. And also, if you do disagree, let me know in the comments why you think what you think and where you think I went wrong. I always look forward to our discussions, and I think it's really fun just, diving into what the actual metagame for this format looks like, because it's a very underexplored format. And, I think that there is a lot of room for potential growth and change. And the first step to doing that is just sort of classifying where we think the format is now. But before we actually dive into the tier list itself, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please do subscribe. I'm about to jump into the next format, which is Android format, and that should be a really fun format. It's a very popular format for a reason. So if you want to be up to date on those videos, then subscribing is the best way to do so. Also, I'd like to hit 600 subscribers by the end of April, and we're almost there. So if you're not already subscribed, please do subscribe. In addition, if you want to play any of the formats that I cover in these videos for yourself, we have a Discord server, link will be in the description down below, but it's a great place to find games against a wide variety of awesome people. So definitely check it out if you're interested. And lastly, if you enjoy the video, as always, please do leave a like down below. It really helps out the visibility of these videos quite a bit. But now that we've gotten all that out of the way, let's dive into the tier list. Now, the decks on this tier list are in no particular order here, but I am going to start not at the actual top of the list, but with a deck that I consider like the baseline deck of this format, and that's just good stuff, which I've symbolized by the Imperial Order here. Now, I think this is a tier 1 deck, meaning that it is basically one of the best decks that you can play in this format, but it's also not completely unbeatable like a tier 0 deck would be. And so I think it's good to set that baseline for what the tier 1 will be, as I think this deck is just the standard deck in the format. With Imperial Format, there's now a high enough number of just good cards that you can just jam them into a deck and pretty much call it a day. And that's what good stuff is. And there are many different ways to build this good stuff deck, but, they all basically share that idea of we're just going to play the best cards in the format, have a bunch of different options, be very versatile, and that's going to be what we're going to do. And that is enough to win most games in the format. So that's where we're going for our tier 1, and I think it's the best deck in the format, even though it definitely isn't tier 0. Now that I've discussed where the baseline for tier 1 is, let me talk about the actual classification of these tiers, just so we're all on the same page here. Tier 1 is the decks that I think are the best in the format, and that will win most games, most likely, if you're skilled enough. Tier 2 are the decks that I think can potentially win some games off of tier 1, but are a bit disadvantaged in general. They're still pretty good, but they just aren't quite consistent enough to be tier 1. Rogue decks are decks that I think can potentially win a game if everything goes their way. But, for everything to go their way, the players got to get pretty lucky. So they won't be winning that often, but they can win games occasionally. And then trash tier are basically decks that I think are not really viable at all. Maybe they win once in a blue moon, but in general, that just takes an incredible amount of luck, and pretty much every other time, you're just going to be losing with this deck. So that's my tier list here, and now that we've sort of classified the baseline for tier 1 and all the other tiers here, let's dive into the first non-good stuff deck on this list, which is Clown Control. And Clown Control, I'm sorry to say, but I am going to put it in trash tier. Now, this may be a bit weird, considering that in Treasure format, I put Clown Control at the top of tier 2, and I think that it could even potentially be a tier 1 deck. But the deck has just gotten so bad this format. It did get tools like Gravity Bind, which is nice, but more spell and trap removal in the form of things like Dust Tornado, as well as Jinzo being able to shut off Gravity Bind, really do hurt it. And also the fact that Jinzo can beat over a clown even if you've used Rush recklessly makes it a bit worse. I just don't really think this deck is as good as it once was anymore. Also, Nobleman of Crossout can really mess up this deck as well. If you're able to Nobleman of Crossout a Recruiter to prevent them from getting out their clowns, then the deck can be a bit dead in the water. So I think this format's just too explosive for this deck to keep up, which is quite unfortunate as I really do like Clown Control, but just not this format. Maybe this will change in the future, but for now, it is going in trash tier. Moving on to a deck that I think is much better than Clown Control, we've got Burn. Now, Burn is in a very interesting spot. Many of its most powerful cards, like Just Desserts and Ceasefire, can be negated by Jinzo, and other cards like Chain Energy can be negated by Imperial Order. But despite this, I do think the deck still is in tier 1. Now, I don't think it's quite as good stuff, but it can win a fair amount of games off of good stuff, especially in game 1 when the good stuff player might not have the tools to actually deal with the burn strategy. And I think that's still good enough in games 2 and 3, even with things like Jinzo and Io and more spell and trap removal, that it's good enough to win a match. In addition, Jinzo can actually really help this deck, as if you manage to clear your opponent's monsters, Jinzo is basically a 2400 attack burn spell, and that can be very good. So I'm putting Burn in tier 1, just a bit under good stuff. Moving on, we've got a deck that surprised me quite a bit in this format, which is Exodia. Now, Exodia did get a piece of support in this format that I think really helps the deck out a lot and brings it up from the trash tier level it was in Treasure format. That piece of support is Backup Soldier. Being able to get back the normal pieces is very nice. In addition, you've still got 3 recruiters in the form of Sangan and Witch, as well as the Mystic Tomatoes to fetch them out from deck. You've got Last Wills, so there are many different ways to just explosively get these pieces in hand, and additional graveyard recursion like Call of the Haunted and Premature Burial help out with that a lot as well. However, if you lose the head, you're kind of out of luck. You can play sort of jank combos with Monster Recovery to get the head back, but I don't really think that's good enough to consider. And I think the deck overall is just tier 2. Not terrible by any means, but I think in general, you do need a little bit of luck to get things going your way. And while the deck can win without the use of Exodia, as you may have seen in the video that I did on the deck, it generally struggles a lot more when it can't pull off that win condition. So I'm putting this in tier 2. Moving on to a deck that, I'm not the biggest fan of, we've got Beatdown. Now, there are many different ways to build Beatdown, but I sort of view the deck largely as sort of like a watered down good stuff deck. So I guess this could go in tier 1 up with good stuff because it's just kind of like unoptimal good stuff in my opinion. But because it is just like a strictly worse version of good stuff, I'm going to put it in tier 2. Now you could debate with me about this placement and say that it should go a bit higher because you can build it just like a good stuff deck, playing some additional Goblin Attack Forces. But I think Goblin Attack Force is a really bad card, actually. I've seen it in games. I've played with it. I don't like it. I don't think it's good enough to see inclusion, although I have heard arguments for it. So, you definitely can play it, just not for me. And I think that the deck just doesn't do enough on its own merits to warrant a tier 1 inclusion. And if you build this deck out to its more jank conclusion, I think that it does just belong in tier 2. So I'm putting Beatdown in tier 2. I could definitely see people putting it at the bottom of tier 1, but I just don't think it actually deserves that spot. Moving on to the next deck, which I like a lot more, we've got Hat's Control. Now, I think this is one of the coolest decks to come out of this format. This was innovated on by people in the YGO from Zero Discord, namely Soul Emerald 69 did a lot of work on this, and I think the deck is super, super sweet. However, while I do love the deck to bits, I think it probably belongs in Rogue. Maybe with more experimentation in the format, people will realize that this belongs in tier 2, but I don't think it's quite consistent enough to be tier 1, and I think that there are just a bit too many ways to disrupt its combo to put it in tier 2. But I do think that it's not a bad deck by any means. I do think it's very good and very fun to play, so I encourage people to test this out, as I do think it's got some legs and got some major potential. Moving on from Hat's Control, we've got another deck that I really like in this format, which is Empty Jar. Now, I know that a lot of people don't like Empty Jar, but I'm a fan. I just think it's fun to try and pull off this combo that's doing things very differently than pretty much any other deck in the game right now. However, I think that while last format, I think it might be tier 1, this format introduced some majorly problematic cards like Nobleman of Crossout, Light of Intervention, and Ceasefire, all of which can make this deck really hard to win with in game 2. You could potentially pull off like a smoke screen into good stuff, but you'd still have enough cards from game 1 that you wouldn't be able to slide out, that I think it would basically be like playing a watered down good stuff deck. And honestly, most of the cards that a good stuff deck is going to side in to deal with this are not that big a deal to include in the deck, so it basically will be playing at full power good stuff. And so I feel like this deck isn't really tier 1 anymore. I am going to put it at the top of tier 2, as I do think that it could maybe have potential to rise up to tier 1, especially given that Morphing Jar number 2, which is its new inclusion, is just such an incredibly powerful card. But I think that you'll have a tougher time winning with this deck than you have in past formats. So I'm going to put it in tier 2. Next up, we've got Relinquished, and I think Relinquished is super, super cool, just like I thought in Treasured Format. However, just like in Treasured Format, I don't think it should be tier 1 for sure. So it's just a question of whether I think it's tier 2 or Rogue. With the new Graveyard Revival, like Call of the Haunted and Premature Burial, you can bring back Relinquished, which makes it a much bigger problem for your opponent. But it still suffers from the same flaws that a lot of other decks do, where, the combo is a bit fragile, so it's easily disruptible, and Relinquished itself doesn't really have any protection, so it's easily destroyed. However, Relinquished is an annoying enough monster on its own that I think this does belong in tier 2, maybe near the bottom of tier 2 just because of how powerful some of the other decks in tier 2 are. But I do think this is a really fun deck. I could definitely see this bumping down to Rogue, though, or just rising up higher in tier 2, given that the metagame is so underdeveloped for this format. And lastly, we've got Hand Control with White Magical Hat. Now, again, just like with Beatdown, I think that this is basically a deck that piggybacks off good stuff most of the time, and it's basically like a watered down version of good stuff that's just trying to do something that I don't really think is necessary. But it is a deck that people like and, play. And it's not bad because it is based around a good stuff core. So I'm going to put it in the center of tier 2, right under Beatdown. You could easily swap this around, but again, I feel like these are just unoptimal versions of good stuff, and they often just do lose to good stuff. And I think that they both also would lose to Burn, just because, Burn is already a tough enough deck to beat playing good stuff, that if you're watering down your deck a bit more, it gets even tougher to beat. So, very interesting how this tier list developed. I think this is probably a sign of not having any official events in this format yet. I am planning on having the next tournament that we hold in our Discord be in Imperial format, so hopefully that should help this tier list sort of develop a bit more and potentially shake up some of the decks in tier 2 and show whether they actually belong there or belong higher or lower. But for now, this is my list, and I'm sticking to it. Let me know what you think of this list down in the comments below. I'm sure that I made some controversial picks here, but I do stand by this after testing out all these decks. Until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.